this is not a system that's broken. This is a system that was built deliberately to preserve power and wealth and opportunity and to distribute that unequally based on race. My name is Afua Hirsch. I'm an author, broadcaster, professor of journalism and writer, and my book Brit-ish on race, identity and belonging, which is a narrative non-fiction book about Britishness, came out in 2018. The British media really seems to suffer in quite a visible way from profound and systemic racism. And some of that is very easy to see. So the last report I read found that 94% of journalists are white, which may not sound that unrepresentative of the population, so around 90% of the population is white. But these are mainly media organisations based in London or in other large urban areas where a quarter to a third of the population are from ethnic minority backgrounds. So the news media are fundamentally not reflecting the society that we live in. And what that does is it really perpetuates the system where the narrative is controlled by people who haven't shared the lived experience of it, who aren't necessarily knowledgeable about race and how racism works. A black footballer buys a house for his mother and he's vilified. A white footballer doesn't and he's a good son. The racialization of crime, which often perpetuates the idea that some crime is inherently a characteristic of ethnic minority groups. And many of these, in some ways, subtle tropes crystallize in people's minds this idea that there is something uniquely criminal or deviant about specific ethnic groups. And that is very much a reality that I think the news media have a very serious case to answer for. My experience is also that when you go on platforms in the mainstream media to discuss racism, a false equivalence often takes place where platforms create a sense of debate between people like me whose message is anti-racism and people who are actively racist. And the idea that you should try and counter anti-racism with racism is a really serious misunderstanding of what racism is. Racism is not an opinion. Racism is contrary to our fundamental values as a democracy, and it's not something that deserves a platform any more than somebody who is pro-genocide or pro-child abuse should be given a platform. I shared recently a clip of a TV debate I did on Sky News in which I raised a critique of the way we talk about British history, and the response was,
"Why do you stay in this country? If you take such offence when you see Nelson's column, if you take such offence when you hear Winston Churchill's name, but if it offends you so much, how do you manage to stay here?"
There is still this idea in Britain that if you are not white, you are not really entitled to Britishness. Your presence here is conditional on behaving in a way other people like or find convenient, and that if you challenge the status quo or offer a critique, an acceptable response is to tell you to leave your own country, which is not something I've ever heard said to a white British person who critiques Britain. It's not been in the interest of the British establishment to eradicate ethnic inequality any more than it has been to eradicate class inequality. The media hasn't had any incentive or insight that would lead it to challenge that system. But I think that this is a time when we can now ask those questions of the ways in which stories are told and begin to take more control of the narrative. The instinct with this current round of protests following the death of George Floyd was to promote them as riots, in many cases, to hone in on the violence. And even when they were largely overwhelmingly peaceful, there was a disproportionate attempt to depict them as violent and confrontational. It's often forgotten that during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was an absolutely vilified figure. He was hated by the mainstream media. It was only after his death and the advent of more radical movements that he began to be eulogized as somebody who represented peaceful change. There is always a tendency to demonize anyone who's asking for change, no matter how reasonably or peacefully those demands are made. I think were it not for the fact that now people have much more agency to shape the narrative themselves because of social media, then we still would think of what's happening now around the world as riots instead of what they are, which is overwhelmingly peaceful protests. Recently, there was this story about this Black Lives Matter protester who rescued a member of the far right who was injured. And he said that he didn't want him to die, so he picked him up and carried him to safety. Had that not been picked up on social media and promoted, it would never have become the mainstream national news story it now is. And you can see how these images that begin on social media are able to really challenge the narrative. There's a whole conversation about why the murder of George Floyd in particular triggered this wave of activism and protest. But It's certainly the case that were it not for the previous waves of Black Lives Matter protests and the ways in which that movement is organised on social media, that this wouldn't have been able to mobilise so quickly and draw on the work that those previous iterations of the Black Lives Matter movement have achieved. I think British people think that plantation slavery, formal segregation, the brutality of plantation economies is something on which America and South America have a monopoly. And they don't realise that Britain had a deep south too. Britain's deep south was the Caribbean. British land run by British families where the genocide and enslavement and torture of Black people happened over centuries. The Industrial Revolution couldn't have taken place without the wealth that flowed from British-owned plantations in the Caribbean. So there's always a willingness to acknowledge that someone else is doing something bad, but Britain is on the right side of history. And I think a lot of that stems from the moral narrative that was created after the Second World War. And this idea that Britain won 2 world wars, never invaded, always on the right side of history. And anything that didn't fit with that sense of national pride was quietly swept under the carpet. It's one of the reasons that it's still, as I speak, taboo to speak about how racist Winston Churchill was, because he is the person who symbolizes our moral victory. People are still being deliberately miseducated. Our children are not being equipped to understand the modern nation that we are, its origins, the ideas about race that Britain created that still shape the ways we self-identify. And I think that that is a real act of neglect. And it's really positive that people are beginning to self-educate by reading our books or listening to podcasts or watching films and documentaries that start to unpick this history. But I would like to see us being serious and intentional about no longer miseducating children so that they're also not equipped to have this conversation until they also reach adulthood and are swept up in a protest movement and realize they urgently need to fill a gap.
Black is beautiful! Black is beautiful!